Welcome, everyone. In this edition of Online for Authors, I have with me Carla Conti, who has written a tell-all book about the prison system. This book is called Chained Birds. Welcome, Carla.
Thank you for having me.
There's a interesting story that all started this, I think, around a snowball. Tell us how that snowball led to the United States versus Kevin Sanders.
Right. So, a abused inmate in the Lewisburg Special Management Unit in Pennsylvania, which was a high security prison that was turned into an experimental prison program for the so-called worst offenders among all federal prisons. In 2011, he was in a recreational cage outside where they were allowed out for basically 1 hour out of the day. And he saw a correctional officer that he used to be incarcerated at his facility previously, and he was abused by that officer. That officer was Captain McDonald. And this inmate, his name was Stephen Tremblay, was triggered by seeing this Captain McDonald, who had just transferred to Lewisburg, and he scooped up some snow and threw it at the captain and caught the captain off guard and made him fall to the ground. And Stephen Tremblay proceeded to kick him to the cheers of the onlookers in all the other recreational cages. And the captain was pretty humiliated. And when he got his composure and other officers rushed in to help him, he subdued Stephen Tremblay, the inmate, on the concrete floor. And he said to him, "Who can I put you in a cage here with?" Oh. And that meant that he was going to set him up for an assault or worse. Yeah. Because those recreational cages were called Thunderdomes at the time. And that started the whole chain reaction of my involvement in the story, getting to meet the other inmate, Kevin Sanders, who is at the heart of the story. It just started everything.
Now, just let me remind everyone, this is not fiction. This is an actual true story. And you were trained as a journalist, and that was mainly your background when you got involved with the story. Tell me what might we see on your writer's murder board in a story like this?
Yeah, so I'm a visual person, and it helps me to cut out clippings and images and things. And I literally made a murder board, as they call it. I had images of various federal prisons where Kevin Sanders, the inmate at the heart of my story, served his time. It began in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. He crossed paths with some very interesting people, including Whitey Bulger. Yeah. For anybody who knows mob history, he was a famous crime boss in Boston. And he ended up serving time with Whitey Bulger. So that was an unexpected and very interesting aspect to the story. Seedy motels and a bus transfer ticket and all kinds of things that were part of this man's odyssey that I followed for 10 years as his advocate and helped on his defense team during the trial.
I was amazed to read about your encounter, his encounter with Whitey Bulger. I'm a writer-producer from Boston. I was very familiar with Whitey. In fact, I was doing a story in Los Angeles for several summers that took place in the building next to where Whitey and his girlfriend had been living for some time. So I was like, It's just one of those do 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 stories. Um, what I was astonished by was the restrictions that Kevin had to deal with in those prisons. And I know that originally he thought he might be able to use his talent drawing some of, he liked to draw, and none of those possibilities were permitted. What was his actual week like? It was, to me, it was unbelievable.
Yeah, so this special management unit was set up to, again, house the worst of the worst federal inmates across the country in the misguided attempt to try to make the other federal prisons safer. And a lot of inmates ended up at Lewisburg who really did not fit the profile of the worst, the big
Right,
gangbangers, the rapists, the murderers. And Kevin was one of those.
right.
Uh, so he was quite dismayed to find out that compared to the previous prison that he transferred from, this was a mostly 24/7 lockdown situation. They were enclosed in very tiny cells that were designed for only one person. This was an old prison, old infrastructure. Two men assigned to a cell the size of a parking spot,
Yeah.
and they were allowed out for 1 hour a day, 5 days a week only, and that was for recreation. They had all their meals served to them inside their
And they weren't allowed to shower except for certain
yes,
times.
showers, I think 5 days a week, but just as far as anything stimulating outside of the cell, it was that recreation for 1 hour a day, 5 days a week. That was it. So it was very punitive in nature. It was supposed to be designed as an incentive to go through programming and other things that would help give the inmate additional freedoms and be able to move on to higher, better levels where they had more freedoms. But it
Right.
really just spawned violence because of all those violent personalities on top of each other in such enclosed spaces. It was a very poorly designed program.
And he spent a lot of time in different places over those last 10 years. In one spot you mentioned, in fact, you mentioned a couple of times how Kevin would take a seat and then he would choose a middle bench as he was being transported in order to get some wiggle room. Explain how he did that. That was really genius.
Well, he was a seasoned con and had a lot of tricks in his bag. And
Yeah.
one of the ways that he was able to create some distance in his belly chain, tied attached to his like handcuffs, and then the leg cuffs
Right.
being transported in all manners, was to kind of exhale and make his body bigger than it really was, so that the correctional officers couldn't really cinch down the chains as tight as they would normally. And then
Genius.
after he was restrained, he would, exhale or let his breath out, and that would give him a
Yep.
little more wiggle room.
Perfect. Yeah.
And this was one of the tricks he taught Whitey Bulger on the bus
Right. Yeah.
heading off to their Florida prison, where they met in 2015 on the tarmac in Orlando.
Unreal.
Kevin had no idea, of course,
Who he was.
and
Right.
yeah, right. And he heard his real name being spoken out loud, and he realized, oh, wow, I'm heading to a prison with Whitey Bulger. And he taught him that trick right away.
That's great. Now, tell me, Carla, how did you become involved with this investigation?
So, my high school friend, Scott Powell, is a lawyer, and he was acting as a public defender at the time in
Right.
2011 in Pennsylvania. And his client was Kevin Sanders. And Kevin had been given assault charges based upon that snowball incident we talked about. The
Right.
through the snowball. The captain did exact his revenge and put that inmate inside a rat cage with Kevin and Kevin's cellmate. And the Aryan Brotherhood, who was calling the shots at the time, insisted that Kevin and his cellmate give a beat down assault or worse. I mean, it could have been deadly to Stephen Tremblay, the snowball thrower. So from those charges, my friend ended up being the lawyer for Kevin, and he was quickly in over his head. It was not a very level playing field for public defenders and their clients compared to the government, which has all the resources. And my friend Scott asked if I would write a story because of my journalism background about Kevin and the conditions he experienced at Lewisburg as kind of a crowdfunding effort to try to raise money for his defense. So I started just getting to know Kevin and everything that was going on in the prison because I was writing about him for a website. And then one thing led to another. And because Scott just didn't have any other help, and I had covered courts and trials and, had that kind of a basis knowledge, I started helping on the defense team.
Yeah, you became part of the defense team,
actually. And we later on were able to get the help of another lawyer who sat second chair pro bono. So I was kind of like their glorified Della Street, as I
right
about it. But then everybody was encouraging me to write the true crime story that was unfolding with this case and the things that Kevin was going through. So I wore a lot of hats throughout the process.
You did. And what would normally, a project like that would normally be completed in a much timelier manner. Why do you think explain why this took nearly 10 years to get this story told? Well, what was the drawbacks? And I know that along the way you had to be discouraged, and yet you continued to write to Kevin to try to encourage him and Scott and even the pro bono attorney. What gave you that stamina to continue?
Well, I wasn't sure it was going to end up being a book throughout this whole 10-year process. I would say I foremost thought of myself as Kevin's advocate and friend on the outside, through the trial process, which took quite a while. There were a lot of legal proceedings and hearings that led up to that. And then there was an appeal, and that took a long time. And when that didn't pan out, he had his prison sentence to finish. So I maintained a friendship with him on the outside. And one of the things that did give him hope was the idea that we would put his story in book form. He wrote me letters, emails, we had phone calls. He told me all kinds of stories and tales, many of which ended up in the book, and something that he always hoped would happen. But along the way, a lot of dangerous things occurred that had me second guessing the smartness of putting this book in print, where he might have to look over his shoulder one day when he's released, because not one but two prison gangs issued hit orders against him for testifying at trial and for other things. So it was tenuous and a little scary.
Yeah.
Eventually, 10 years elapsed. He was released from prison, and the timing felt right for me to be able to put it in print. I had more distance some of the threats.
Right.
And it was a big measure of closure that I needed to have personally to put this to rest by putting it in print. So that's why it took so long.
Well, the interesting thing to me was that he always told people that it was going to be a book. And so that word got around to the wrong people. And there were threats that you had heard about that they were going to go after him, and there was a time when it even became public that they were going to go after Scott and even you. I know you're married and have children, and what did your husband feel about the threats, and or how much did he actually know?
Well, I guess I wasn't 100% candid all along the journey with
Right.
how dire I felt the threats were. And partly because I wasn't really sure. I was getting a lot of conflicting information. And this stems from end, the last third of the book when Kevin is released and he encountered uh, some gang members from a previous prison of his that wanted some revenge against him for an incident that had happened long before Scott and I even met him. And it just wasn't clear during the time frame that Kevin said, "Oh, your life is in danger, yours and Scott's, because this prison gang has my address book and you guys are in it." And
Yeah.
Kevin, like you said, had been telling people, "Hey, somebody's going to write a book about me." I mean, that's kind of irresistible to not say to people, right? If you think somebody's going to write a book about your life. So all of those things culminated toward the end of the book when he was released, and it was scary, and I kind of dealt with it by not dealing with it. I
Right.
didn't talk a lot about it, but at that point I was not writing the book. I was saying
That's
to myself,
true. That's true.
absolutely not writing this
What
book.
did you think of that Judge Anderson? I mean, I couldn't believe him. Uh, There really is a person like that out there.
There really is, and I will tell you that every word attributed to him comes from court transcript or some kind of brief or legal writing that he produced. It's all 100% factual.
It's
Everything he
amazing.
did, everything that he said, I have the receipts for. And I've heard from a lot of people who've read the book that they can't believe how much he seemed to have his mind made up from the get-go. And it
Right.
just goes to show the how unbalanced it is for prosecutors who have the government on their side and the judges and the juries who also don't want to know what goes on behind prison or don't want to believe a convict on the stand. The defense and indigent clients in particular are at a big disadvantage.
Usually, yeah, absolutely. Um, Most of the notes that you took during the many hearings you shared with Scott and was it Jack, I think. Um, how did the three of you work together? I mean, Scott, I know, actually spent a lot of his own money on this case, um, which wasn't simple for him. And it just seemed like there was always a need that had to be filled. And then he met Lucy. How was Lucy with regard to the three of you? Did she become more involved once they got together, or was she pretty much separate?
She was always a confidant of Scott's, and because she had a lot of connections within the district that Scott worked as a lawyer, he relied on her advice, and she did a lot of pro bono work for indigent defendants from her law firm. So she had a lot of experience, and she was a very great sideline player. But of course, the bulk of the work was done by Scott and then his friend Jack, who joined the case not long after I started helping out with the case. So Scott, Jack, and I, we got together a lot. We did a lot of work online together, a lot of collaboration.
Yeah.
Back in the day, when cloud services and cloud sharing was in its infancy, and because I'm just kind of a tech geek person, I
Right.
did one of the first setups for that, where we could share information back and forth. So I kept us organized, kept us on track, but they were the legal minds that, had to put the briefs and the legal work together.
Yeah, it seems so. At one point during the long 10-year period, Jack actually passed away, and you were left with you and Scott. And then I know that there was some tension between the two of you at some point, and even you and Jack, I mean, even you and Scott didn't spend a lot of time together towards the end of that 10-year period. So you were kind of left with a lot of stuff that hadn't been tied together. Um, how did it eventually come to be a book?
I would say that, and not to give away spoilers, but
Right.
his transition into society was not successful. He is still released from prison. And the things that happened, as far as threats against me, threats against Scott, and the last time that I said, I'm absolutely not writing this book. I don't want to put anybody in harm's way, including myself, my family.
Right.
I put everything into boxes, and they were in my basement. And we had just finished a renovation in our house, and I was trying to clean out these boxes and other boxes, and what was I going to put back into my home office. And I started looking through the case files. It had been a few years since I had seen any of it, and I came across lots of notes and things, and I just was trying to organize them. And I came across a yellow legal pad with my notes from an interview with Stephen Tremblay, the inmate who threw the snowball.
Right.
And I said to myself, I haven't thought about that in years. And it hit me like a cartoon light bulb, like, oh my gosh, that snowball, that started everything. And then my wheels are turning, and I'm thinking, oh, what a perfect way to start this story. And then I started thinking, well, I don't know, has enough time gone by? Do I feel safe writing this?
Yeah.
And one thing led to another, and then I just couldn't not write it at that point.
So then I know that originally you had pitched it to a couple of agents who kept saying their response was, well, we have to wait for what happens, with the judge and how the case actually ends. And um, how did you, how were you able to get the agent to get it published?
Yes, so I did go to another writers' conference, a separate one. I don't think I included this in the book. The summer before I got my book contract, I had written a proposal for it, which you can do with nonfiction books. You can often submit a proposal. So I went to a writers' conference, met some agents. Some of them were interested in a full proposal, but I had no real takers. And I just thought to myself, you know what? I'll just self-publish this. The information's all out there. It's easy enough to do. People are doing this.
Right.
And as I was preparing to do that, on a whim, I submitted to 2 publishers who specialize in true crime, and you did not need an agent for. And one of them was Wild Blue Press, and they were interested immediately. And they bought the whole book based on my proposal and a few sample chapters. That was in December of 2023. And so I had my book deal with them, and everything, it launched less than a year later, November of 2024. So I'm still unagented.
Yes, you are. Well, maybe this will make more people interested in getting you. Are you working on a new book?
I talked about a book that I had an opportunity or an attempt to publish like 30 years ago. I talked about that In Chain Birds, and it takes place in my husband's hometown. And it's a true crime story. It originated in the 1970s. It's a love triangle murder situation. And that whole story came to light again in the 1990s when a body was exhumed. And
Wow.
at the time, that story was making some national headlines, national news. And there was a People magazine writer who wrote a paperback book based on the case at the time. So I was not able to get my version of the story published, even though I had a literary agent who was, submitting it everywhere. So all these years later, I'm thinking I can go back and complete that story. And there are parts of the story that happened after the People magazine writer wrote her book. So there's a valid reason besides just me wanting to complete something I didn't get to do for writing an updated version of that true crime story. So I think that's going to be my next project.
It's interesting. And it probably won't be as scary or threatening as this
I
one
was
was.
not personally threatened in that version. So that is correct.
That's really good. So you think that true crime is your niche? That's where it is, right?
I do. I have 3 or 4 other true crime or nonfiction crime stories outlined that I plan to get to. I did even outline a fiction thriller story, so I might attempt that at some point, but I have a lot of projects to keep me busy.
You do. So I know that having worked in television news and documentaries, that when we write in this style, we are plotters. We plot the story. And people are asked all the time, are you a plotter or a pantster? And yet, when you get to some of the stories that, you're not sure exactly what happened behind the scenes, does that turn you into a pantster? Do you have any fictionalization there, or do you continue with the plotting? What would you say?
Well, I only have this one book as my history, so I would say it was plotted to the extent of I knew what the ending was when I
Right.
started to write it. But the way it took shape maybe took me by surprise. The way I ended up crafting the narrative uh, was not always something I had planned, but I think it ended up being presented the way it should have been presented.
Right.
It doesn't look exactly like my outline proposal that I submitted. So maybe a combination of both.
There is a little in there. That's interesting. I've spoken to other people who just realized, oh, well, I thought I was a plotter, but there is some pantster in me. I don't know. I know that our listeners and our viewers who might be interested in reading Chain Birds can actually go online, go to Facebook, and go to Novels and Latte, and there's a possibility that you might even win a digital version of this book. So, Carla, if other people wanted to contact you about when your next book is coming out, do you have a website or an email that they might use to get to you?
Yes, my blog is under my full name, carlajeanconti.com. And I'm on social media with that same handle everywhere, Carla Jean Conti. And people can reach me through my blog and social media. And I have a newsletter on my blog. And I'm just now starting to release some additional stories to Chain Birds with a plan of putting on some of Kevin's artwork also. And
That
when
would be great. Yeah.
subscribers will get first exclusive access to that bonus content. So
That would be
the
great.
newsletter.
That's great. Well, it has certainly been very enjoyable talking with you, and I look forward to the next book that you are writing. So
Well,
thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me and choosing Chained Birds for this episode. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Online for Authors, where I, Terry M. Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch. Tune in next Tuesday for another podcast episode.